The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's hardware store in Millbrook, Texas, as 73-year-old Frank Harrison limped toward the entrance. His weathered Navy SEAL pin gleamed on his worn jacket, a silent testament to decades of service most people would never truly understand. But Officer Jake Mitchell had seen enough fake heroes in his 5 years on the force to spot what he believed was another fraud from 50 feet away. In 30 minutes, this routine confrontation would spiral into a moment that would shake the entire town and force everyone to confront the difference between assumption and truth. What started as a simple case of suspected stolen valor would become something far more complex, revealing secrets that had been buried for over 40 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Harrison had always been an early riser. Old habits from his military days never truly faded, and at 73, he still found himself awake before dawn, watching the Texas sunrise paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. This particular Thursday morning felt no different from countless others as he prepared for his weekly trip to Murphy's hardware store, where he'd been a regular customer for the past 15 years since moving to Millbrook. The small town had welcomed him quietly, the way small towns often do with newcomers who keep to themselves and pay their bills on time. Frank preferred it that way. He'd had enough attention for several lifetimes, enough recognition ceremonies and medal presentations to last him well into whatever years remained. These days, he found peace in the simple routine of maintaining his modest ranch-style home, tending to his small garden and making occasional trips into town for supplies. As he pulled his faded blue pickup truck into the familiar parking lot, Frank noticed the increased police presence around downtown Millbrook. Officer Jake Mitchell's patrol car sat prominently near the hardware store, and Frank could see the young officer inside, apparently filling out paperwork. Frank had encountered Mitchell a few times over the years during routine traffic stops and community events, but their interactions had been brief and professional. Jake Mitchell represented everything that Frank had once been, but approached from a completely different angle. At 28, Mitchell had joined the Millbrook Police Department with genuine intentions to serve his community, but his experience had been shaped primarily by dealing with the small-town problems that rarely made headlines. Domestic disputes, minor theft, traffic violations, and the occasional bar fight comprised most of his daily responsibilities. What bothered Mitchell most, however, were the individuals he encountered who seemed to trade on military service they'd never actually performed. In his 5 years wearing the badge, Mitchell had encountered at least a dozen cases of what he'd learned to identify as stolen valor. Men usually middle-aged or older, wearing military insignia, claiming combat experience, or displaying medals they'd never earned. Some did it for attention, others for discounts at local businesses, and a few seemed to genuinely believe their own fabricated stories after years of telling them. Each encounter had hardened Mitchell's skepticism and sharpened his ability to spot what he considered obvious frauds. Frank stepped out of his truck, his movements betraying the subtle stiffness that comes from decades of hard physical use and old injuries that never quite heal properly. He wore his typical outfit, well-worn jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and a light jacket despite the warming morning air. On the left side of his jacket, positioned with military precision, was a small Navy SEAL trident pin, its gold finish catching the early sunlight. Mitchell noticed the pin immediately. His trained eye catalogued the details: the elderly man's somewhat unkempt appearance, the older vehicle, the way he moved with obvious physical limitations. In Mitchell's experience, real Navy SEALs carried themselves differently. They were typically in better physical condition, more alert, something that this old man seemed to lack. The pin looked authentic enough, but Mitchell had learned that authentic-looking military insignia were readily available online for anyone willing to spend $20 and pretend to be a hero. Frank made his way toward the hardware store entrance, unaware that he was being observed and evaluated. His mind was focused on the day's simple mission, purchasing replacement hinges for his garden gate, picking up some weatherproofing stain, and maybe having a brief conversation with Tom Murphy about the upcoming town council meeting. These small interactions had become the comfortable rhythm of his civilian life, a stark contrast to the years when every day had carried the potential for life or death decisions. Mitchell finished his paperwork and stepped out of his patrol car. Something about the elderly man bothered him, though he couldn't immediately articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the casual way the man wore the seal pin, as if it were just another piece of clothing, rather than a symbol of one of the most elite military units in the world. Or maybe it was the man's overall appearance, which struck Mitchell as inconsistent with the image he had of special operations veterans. As Frank reached for the hardware store door, Mitchell made his decision. He'd conducted enough of these investigations to know the routine. Ask a few pointed questions about military service, request some form of identification or documentation, and usually the fraud would quickly become apparent. Most people wearing unearned military insignia couldn't answer basic questions about military life, or would become defensive when pressed for details. "Excuse me, sir," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected over years of police work. Frank turned, his weathered face showing mild curiosity rather than concern. "I'm Officer Mitchell with Millbrook PD. I couldn't help but notice your military pin there. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Frank's expression remained neutral, though something shifted almost imperceptibly in his eyes. After decades of life experience, he'd learned to read situations quickly, and he could sense this wasn't a casual conversation. "Of course, officer. What can I help you with?" Mitchell approached closer, his posture professional but unmistakably suspicious. "That's a Navy SEAL pin you're wearing. A pretty significant piece of military history there. When did you serve?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Frank studied the young officer for a moment, recognizing the skepticism behind the professional demeanor. He'd encountered this type of suspicion before, though not often and never quite so directly from law enforcement. "I served from 1968 to 1992, Frank replied evenly. "Spent most of those years in various assignments that I'm not particularly fond of discussing in parking lots." Mitchell's skepticism deepened. The man's answer was vague, in exactly the way he'd come to expect from people trying to avoid specific questions about military service they'd never actually performed. Real veterans, in his experience, were usually more forthcoming with basic information about their service, especially when questioned by law enforcement. "I see," Mitchell responded, pulling out his notepad. "And what was your rank when you left service?" Frank's jaw tightened slightly. Not from nervousness, but from a growing irritation at being interrogated like a common criminal in front of a store where he'd been shopping peacefully for 15 years. "Chief Petty Officer," he answered, his voice maintaining its steady tone despite his internal frustration. The answer came too quickly for Mitchell's liking, too prepared. He'd learned that people telling the truth often paused to think, while those fabricating stories had their answers ready. "Chief Petty Officer Harrison, then? And you were a Navy SEAL during that entire period?" Frank's eyes narrowed slightly at the continued questioning, but his military training had taught him the value of maintaining composure under pressure. "Not the entire period, Officer Mitchell. SEAL training came later in my career. Most of my early service was conventional Navy operations." Mitchell wrote down the response, though his suspicion was growing rather than diminishing. The elderly man's answers were consistent but felt rehearsed, and his overall demeanor didn't match what Mitchell expected from someone who had supposedly completed one of the most rigorous military training programs in the world. "I'm going to need to see some identification, sir, and if you have any documentation of your military service, that would be helpful as well." The request for documentation was where Mitchell expected this encounter to reach its conclusion. In his experience, people wearing unearned military insignia rarely carried the paperwork to back up their claims. Frank reached into his wallet and produced his driver's license without hesitation. handing it over to the officer with the same steady composure he'd maintained throughout the questioning. "Frank J. Harrison," Mitchell read aloud, comparing the information to the man standing before him. The address matched local records, and the man appeared to be who he claimed to be, at least in terms of basic identity. "What about military documentation, Mr. Harrison?" Frank's expression darkened slightly, not from fear of exposure, but from a growing anger at being treated like a criminal for wearing insignia he'd earned through years of sacrifice most people could never imagine. "Officer Mitchell, I don't typically carry my DD-214 or service records when I go shopping for hardware supplies. Most veterans don't. Mitchell's training had taught him to press harder when suspects became defensive, and Frank's response about not carrying documentation struck him as exactly the kind of deflection he'd encountered from previous stolen Valor cases. The morning foot traffic around Murphy's Hardware was beginning to increase, and several townspeople had started to notice the confrontation between the police officer and the elderly man they recognized as a quiet neighborhood fixture. "Mr. Harrison, I understand that most people don't carry their military records shopping," Mitchell continued, his tone becoming more formal and authoritative. "But when someone is wearing insignia representing one of the most elite units in the American military, it raises questions that need answers. Stolen valor is a serious offense, both legally and morally. The accusation hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down on ancient battlefields. Frank felt something cold settle in his chest, not fear, but a familiar anger that he'd learned to control decades ago during missions where losing composure could mean the difference between life and death. He'd faced enemy fire, political interrogations, and congressional hearings with the same steady resolve he now summoned in a small-town parking lot. "Officer Mitchell," Frank said, his voice dropping to a register that carried unmistakable authority, despite his civilian appearance. "I've worn this pin for over 30 years. I earned it in places and circumstances that I suspect are well beyond your current understanding of military operations. If you're accusing me of stolen valor, then I suggest you be very certain of your facts before proceeding." The subtle shift in Frank's demeanor wasn't lost on Mitchell, but the young officer interpreted it as the bluster of someone caught in a lie rather than the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, especially not in a hardware store parking lot. Mitchell had encountered similar responses before from individuals who became aggressive when their fabricated military stories were challenged. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station for further questioning," Mitchell announced, reaching for his handcuffs. "We can sort this out properly there, and you'll have the opportunity to provide whatever documentation you claim to have." Frank's eyes widened, not with fear, but with genuine disbelief. In all his years as a civilian, through all his quiet attempts to blend into normal American life, he had never imagined finding himself in this particular situation. The irony wasn't lost on him that after surviving classified operations that would never appear in any public record, he was being arrested in front of Murphy's Hardware store for wearing a pin that represented the most difficult period of his entire life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Officer, you're making a serious mistake," Frank said quietly, extending his hands as Mitchell approached with the handcuffs. "One that I suspect you'll regret very shortly." Mitchell secured the handcuffs with professional efficiency, though something about Frank's calm acceptance of the arrest bothered him more than outright resistance would have. Most guilty parties either became combative or started confessing immediately when faced with actual arrest. Frank simply stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. The small crowd that had gathered consisted primarily of local business owners and regular customers who recognized Frank as a long-time resident. Margaret Thompson, who ran the flower shop next to Murphy's Hardware, watched the scene with growing concern. She'd known Frank for over a decade, had seen him quietly help elderly neighbors with home repairs, had watched him donate anonymously to local charities. Whatever was happening seemed fundamentally wrong. Tom Murphy himself emerged from his hardware store, drawn by the commotion and the sight of one of his most reliable customers being arrested. Murphy was a Navy veteran himself, though his service had been limited to stateside assignments during peacetime. He'd always sensed something different about Frank Harrison, something that suggested experiences far beyond typical military service. But Frank had never been one to discuss his past. "Jake, what's going on here?" Murphy called out, using the familiar tone of someone who'd watched Mitchell grow up in the community. "Frank's been shopping here for 15 years. What could he possibly have done?" Mitchell turned toward Murphy, his professional demeanor firmly in place. "Mr. Murphy, this gentleman appears to be wearing military insignia that he may not have earned. We're going to sort it out at the station." Murphy's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. As a veteran himself, he understood the seriousness of stolen valor accusations, but he also understood something about character that came from years of observing people. Frank Harrison carried himself with a quiet dignity that Murphy had learned to associate with individuals who had seen and done things they preferred not to discuss. "Officer Mitchell," Murphy said carefully, "I've known Frank Harrison for a long time. If he says he earned that pin, I'd be inclined to believe him." Frank appreciated Murphy's support, but he also understood the position everyone was in. Without documentation immediately available, without witnesses who could verify service that had occurred decades ago in circumstances that remained classified, he appeared to be exactly what Mitchell suspected, an elderly man trading on military service he'd never performed. As Mitchell guided Frank toward the patrol car, Frank's mind was already working through the implications of his arrest. His service records were complex, with significant portions classified at levels that local law enforcement would never be able to access quickly. His commanding officers from the relevant periods were either deceased, retired to locations unknown, or still bound by security clearances that prevented them from discussing operations that officially had never occurred. The drive to the Millbrook police station passed in relative silence, with Mitchell occasionally glancing in his rearview mirror at his prisoner. Frank sat quietly in the back seat, his expression unreadable, his mind cataloging the steps he would need to take to resolve this situation. He'd faced more challenging circumstances, though admittedly none quite so absurd. At the station, Mitchell processed Frank through the standard booking procedures with professional efficiency. Fingerprints, photographs, personal property inventory, and the routine questions that accompanied every arrest. Frank answered the administrative questions without resistance, providing basic information while declining to elaborate on the circumstances that had led to his arrest. Detective Sarah Reynolds, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who served as Mitchell's supervisor, observed the booking process with growing interest. She'd worked with Mitchell long enough to respect his instincts about stolen valor cases, but something about this particular arrest struck her as different. The elderly man's comfort, his calm acceptance of the process, his refusal to become defensive or angry, suggested someone with experience in stressful situations that extended far beyond normal civilian life. "Mitchell," Reynolds said quietly, pulling the younger officer aside, "what exactly do we have here?" Mitchell outlined his observations and suspicions, describing Frank's vague answers about his military service and his inability to produce immediate documentation. Reynolds listened carefully, but her own instincts were suggesting a more complex situation than a simple case of stolen valor. "Has he asked for a lawyer?" Reynolds inquired. "No, ma'am. He's been cooperative throughout the process, but he hasn't provided any information that would substantiate his claims about military service." Reynolds studied Frank through the observation window, watching him sit calmly in the interview room, his posture erect despite his age, his eyes alert and focused. She'd interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career, and Frank Harrison didn't present like someone caught in a lie. He presented like someone waiting patiently for other people to figure out they'd made a mistake. "Let me handle the interview," Reynolds decided. "I want to get a better sense of what we're dealing with before this goes any further." Frank looked up as Detective Reynolds entered the interview room, recognizing immediately that this was someone with significantly more experience and authority than the young patrol officer who had arrested him. Reynolds settled into the chair across from him, her expression professional but less confrontational than Mitchell's had been. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Detective Reynolds. I understand there's some question about your military service and the insignia you were wearing. Would you like to help us clear this up?" Frank studied the detective for a moment, appreciating her more measured approach. "Detective Reynolds, I served my country for 24 years in various capacities. Some of that service involved assignments that I'm not permitted to discuss in detail, even decades later. What specific information would help resolve this situation?" The response was more forthcoming than anything Mitchell had reported, and Reynolds found herself increasingly convinced that they were dealing with something more complicated than a simple case of stolen valor. Frank's manner of speaking, his choice of words, his obvious familiarity with military protocols and security classifications suggested genuine experience rather than fabricated stories. "Can you provide us with any contact information for former commanding officers or fellow service members who could verify your SEAL qualification?" Reynolds asked. Frank considered the question carefully. Most of his former teammates were either deceased, living under assumed identities for security reasons, or bound by the same classification restrictions that limited his own ability to discuss their shared experiences. However, there was one possibility, one person who might be both accessible and authorized to confirm at least the basic facts of his service. "Detective, there may be someone who could help verify my service record. Commander William Torres, currently stationed at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. He's one of the few people still on active duty who would have access to the necessary classified files and the authority to discuss them with law enforcement." Detective Reynolds made a note of Commander Torres' name and location, recognizing immediately that this was the first concrete lead they'd received in what was becoming an increasingly complex situation. Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado wasn't a facility that appeared in routine law enforcement databases, and the specificity of Frank's reference suggested knowledge that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly. "Mr. Harrison, you understand that contacting military personnel for verification of service records isn't something we do routinely," Reynolds explained. "Most stolen valor cases are resolved through readily available documentation or obvious inconsistencies in the suspect's story." Frank nodded, understanding the detective's position, while also recognizing that his own situation fell well outside normal parameters. "Detective, I realize this complicates your investigation, but my service record isn't contained in standard military personnel files. Much of what I did was classified then and remains classified now. Commander Torres is one of the few people authorized to confirm basic facts about my service without compromising ongoing security protocols." Reynolds found herself in uncharted territory. Her experience with stolen valor cases typically involved individuals who wilted under questioning or produced obviously fraudulent documentation. Frank's calm insistence on contacting high-level military officials suggested either an elaborate delusion or legitimate service that had been conducted at classification levels beyond routine law enforcement access. While Reynolds considered her next move, word of Frank's arrest had begun spreading through Millbrook's tight-knit community. Margaret Thompson had called several mutual acquaintances, including Pastor David Chen from the community church, where Frank occasionally attended services. Chen had always found Frank to be a man of few words but obvious integrity, someone who contributed quietly to church activities without seeking recognition or attention. At the Millbrook Diner, the morning coffee crowd had quickly made Frank's arrest their primary topic of conversation. The regulars included several veterans from different eras and branches of service, men who had developed their own informal network for recognizing authentic military experience. Jerry Walsh, a Vietnam-era Army veteran, spoke up with characteristic directness. "I've known Frank Harrison for 8 years, Walsh announced to the gathered crowd. "Met him at the VA clinic in Austin. Never heard him tell a war story, never heard him brag about his service, never heard him ask for special treatment because of what he might have done. That's not the behavior of someone pretending to be something he isn't." The conversation at the diner reflected a growing division in community opinion. Younger residents, particularly those without military experience, tended to support Officer Mitchell's actions as appropriate law enforcement response to suspected fraud. Older residents, especially veterans, found themselves increasingly skeptical of the stolen valor charges against a man they'd observed quietly contributing to community life for over a decade. Back at the police station, Detective Reynolds made the decision to contact Naval Special Warfare Command. The phone number Frank had provided connected her to a reception desk that immediately transferred her call through multiple levels of military bureaucracy, each transfer requiring her to explain her purpose and credentials to increasingly senior personnel. After 20 minutes of navigation through military phone systems, Reynolds found herself speaking with Lieutenant Commander Jessica Martinez, who served as a liaison between Naval Special Warfare Command and civilian law enforcement agencies. Martinez listened carefully to Reynolds' explanation of the situation, asking detailed questions about Frank's claims and the circumstances of his arrest. "Detective Reynolds, before I can discuss any individual service record, even in general terms, I need to verify your credentials and obtain proper authorization for this type of inquiry," Martinez explained. "Can you provide your badge number, department contact information, and the specific nature of the charges involved?" Reynolds provided the requested information, understanding that the military's caution about discussing personnel records reflected legitimate security concerns rather than bureaucratic obstruction. Martinez indicated that she would need several hours to verify Reynolds' credentials and determine what information, if any, could be released about Frank Harrison's service record. While Reynolds waited for military verification, Frank remained in the holding cell, using the time to consider the broader implications of his situation. He'd spent decades maintaining a low profile specifically to avoid the kind of attention that his arrest was now generating. The classified nature of much of his service meant that even clearing his name would potentially expose operational details that were better left undisclosed. Officer Mitchell, meanwhile, was reviewing his arrest report with growing uneasiness. His supervisor's decision to contact high-level military officials suggested that this case might be more complicated than he'd initially assessed. Mitchell's confidence in his stolen valor identification skills was beginning to waver as he reconsidered. Frank's responses to his initial questions, the first concrete development, came when Pastor Chen arrived at the police station, asking to speak with Detective Reynolds about Frank's character and community standing. Chen brought with him a folder of documentation showing Frank's quiet contributions to various church activities, including substantial anonymous donations and volunteer work, helping elderly parishioners with home repairs. "Detective, I understand you have to investigate these accusations," Chen said earnestly. "But Frank Harrison has been a pillar of quiet service in our community for years. He's helped dozens of people, never asked for recognition, never traded on any military background for special treatment. This arrest doesn't align with anything I know about his character." Reynolds appreciated the character reference, though she understood that community standing didn't necessarily resolve questions about military service. However, Chen's testimony added another layer to the increasingly complex picture of Frank Harrison. The pattern of quiet, anonymous service to others was consistent with certain types of military training and experience, particularly among special operations personnel who were taught to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Commander Martinez called back with authorization to discuss certain aspects of Frank Harrison's service record. Martinez's tone was noticeably different from their initial conversation, carrying an undertone of concern that suggested significant developments in her investigation. Detective Reynolds, I can confirm that we have extensive records for Chief Petty Officer Franklin James Harrison, who served with Naval Special Warfare Units from 1973 to 1992, Martinez began. However, much of his service record remains classified, and I'm not authorized to discuss specific operations or assignments. Reynolds felt a mixture of relief and concern at the confirmation. Relief that Frank's basic claims appeared legitimate, but concern about what the classification restrictions might mean for resolving the immediate legal situation. Can you verify his SEAL qualification? Reynolds asked. I can confirm that Chief Petty Officer Harrison successfully completed basic underwater demolition SEAL training and served in various special warfare capacities throughout his naval career, Martinez replied. Detective, may I ask about the circumstances that led to this inquiry? Reynolds explained the stolen Valor arrest, the community reaction, and the need to resolve questions about Frank's right to wear SEAL insignia. Martinez listened carefully, asking several pointed questions about the specific accusations and Frank's responses to questioning. Detective, I need to escalate this inquiry to my commanding officer, Martinez finally said. The individual you have in custody served with distinction in several highly classified operations. His arrest on stolen Valor charges is going to require command attention at levels well above my authorization. The call ended with Martinez promising to contact Reynolds within 2 hours with further guidance from senior command. Reynolds hung up the phone with the growing certainty that Millbrook's police department had stumbled into something far more significant than a routine stolen Valor case. Frank, still waiting in the holding cell, noticed increased activity around the police station. Officers and staff members were having hushed conversations, and he could sense the shift in atmosphere that indicated his situation was evolving in ways that extended beyond local law enforcement capabilities. Detective, Reynolds approached Frank's cell with a mixture of professional duty and personal awkwardness. The military's confirmation of Frank's basic service record had fundamentally altered her perception of the case. Though many questions remained unanswered, Mr. Harrison, I've spoken with Naval Special Warfare Command, Reynolds began. They've confirmed your military service and SEAL qualification. However, there are still procedural matters we need to address before we can resolve your case. Frank looked up at the detective with an expression that combined vindication with weary resignation. Detective, I told you this morning that you were making a mistake. I understand that you are doing your job, but some mistakes have consequences that extend beyond what you might expect. The consequences Frank alluded to began manifesting within the hour. Lieutenant Commander Martinez's escalation had reached the desk of Captain Robert Sullivan, commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 1, who immediately recognized Frank Harrison's name from classified operational files that spanned 2 decades of critical missions. Sullivan's reaction to learning about Frank's arrest was swift and decisive. Within 30 minutes of receiving Martinez's report, Captain Sullivan was on a secure phone line with Admiral Patricia Hendricks at Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters. The conversation that followed would have profound implications, not just for Frank's immediate situation, but for how the military handled the protection of retired special operations personnel whose service records contained information that could never be fully disclosed. Admiral, we have a significant problem, Sullivan began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the broader ramifications of the situation. Chief Harrison was involved in Operation Neptune's Mirror, the Iranian hostage situation support missions, and at least 6 other classified operations that are still sealed. His arrest on stolen Valor charges could expose operational details that remain sensitive even after 30 years. The ceremony took place in Millbrook's Central Park, where a new memorial honoring all veterans had been hastily planned and constructed in the 3 weeks following Frank's vindication. The memorial project, funded entirely by community donations that poured in after news of his arrest spread beyond the town limits, represented something deeper than simple guilt over his mistreatment. It embodied a community's recognition that they had failed to properly honor the veterans in their midst, not through malicious intent, but through the subtle neglect of taking heroism for granted when it chose to remain humble. Commander William Torres had driven 12 hours from San Diego to attend the ceremony, bringing with him a delegation of active-duty SEALs whose presence transformed the small-town gathering into something resembling a military honor ceremony. Torres carried with him not just his personal respect for Frank, but official recognition from Naval Special Warfare Command that would finally allow some details of Frank's service to be shared with the community that had initially doubted him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres began, his voice carrying across the park through a sound system donated by local businesses. "I'm here today to tell you about a man who served his country in ways that most of you will never fully understand, in places that don't appear on any maps you've seen. During operations that officially never happened, the crowd, which included not just Millbrook residents, but veterans from across 3 counties who had traveled to show their support, listened in complete silence as Torres began to outline the broad parameters of Frank's service without revealing classified details. "Chief, Petty Officer Franklin Harrison spent 24 years serving in some of the most dangerous and sensitive operations our military has ever conducted. He prevented international incidents that could have led to war. He saved American lives in circumstances where failure would have meant not just personal death, but potential catastrophe for American foreign policy. He did all of this without seeking recognition, without asking for special treatment, and without ever breaking the sacred trust that classified service requires." Frank stood beside the podium, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that had become second nature during decades of military ceremonies. His expression remained characteristically stoic, though those who knew him well could see the emotional weight of having his private service made public. "Even in the most respectful possible circumstances," Torres continued, his voice gaining intensity as he addressed the broader implications of Frank's arrest and vindication. 3 weeks ago, this community made a mistake that could have happened anywhere in America. You allowed suspicion to override respect, assumptions to replace investigation, and skepticism to triumph over the benefit of doubt that every veteran has earned through their service. The words hit the assembled crowd with visible impact. Many had supported Frank throughout his ordeal, but Torres's perspective forced them to confront the reality that their initial doubt had been based not on evidence, but on the dangerous assumption that heroes always look like heroes, that service always announces itself, that sacrifice is always visible to casual observation. Officer Jake Mitchell sat in the front row, wearing his dress uniform, but carrying the weight of professional and personal responsibility for the events that had brought them all together. In the 3 weeks since Frank's arrest, Mitchell had undergone a profound transformation in his understanding of both military service and law enforcement responsibility. He had requested additional training on veterans issues, had begun working with local veterans organizations to better understand military culture, and had developed a new approach to investigating stolen Valor claims that emphasized verification before accusation. Detective Sarah Reynolds, seated beside Mitchell, had used the experience to develop new department protocols for handling military-related cases. The procedures she'd written, now being adopted by law enforcement agencies across the state, emphasized the complexity of military service records, the prevalence of classified operations that couldn't be easily verified, and the importance of consulting with military authorities before making arrests on stolen valor charges. As Torres concluded his remarks, he turned to Frank with an expression that combined professional respect with personal affection. "Chief Harrison, on behalf of every SEAL who served with you, every SEAL who serves today, and every SEAL who will serve in the future, I want to thank you for maintaining the standards of honor, courage, and commitment that define our brotherhood, even when that commitment was tested by unjust treatment from the very community you served to protect." Frank stepped to the podium, surveying the crowd of faces that included everyone from the local bank president to children barely old enough to understand what the ceremony meant. His speech, which he had spent 3 weeks reluctantly preparing, would be the most extensive public remarks he had made about his military service in the 30 years since his retirement. "I never wanted to be standing here today," Frank began, his voice carrying clearly across the park. "For 3 decades, I've tried to live as a normal citizen of this community, contributing quietly and asking for nothing beyond the simple respect that neighbors show each other. The events of 3 weeks ago changed that forever. And while I can't say I'm happy about the attention, I hope something positive can come from what happened." Frank paused, looking directly at Officer Mitchell before continuing. Officer Mitchell made a mistake that day, but it was a mistake born of good intentions and proper concern for honoring military service. The real problem wasn't his suspicion of stolen valor. Stolen valor is a real crime that deserves law enforcement attention. The problem was our collective failure as a society to understand the complexity of military service and the many different ways that people serve their country. The speech continued for 20 minutes, with Frank addressing themes that had emerged from his experience: the importance of asking questions before making accusations, the need to protect classified service members' privacy while still honoring their contributions, and the responsibility every community bears for supporting veterans, regardless of whether their service is publicly visible. "Military service isn't always dramatic or obvious," Frank explained. "Most veterans return to civilian life and blend seamlessly into their communities, contributing through work, family, and civic engagement rather than through public displays of their military experience. Some of us served in ways that we're not permitted to discuss, not because we're ashamed of our service, but because the nature of that service requires continued secrecy even decades later." As Frank spoke, Margaret Thompson found herself reflecting on the 3 weeks of community soul-searching that had followed his arrest. The flower shop owner had organized multiple community meetings where residents discussed not just Frank's specific case, but broader questions about how they recognized and supported veterans. The conversations had revealed that Millbrook was home to dozens of veterans whose service had gone largely unrecognized, not because the community didn't care, but because both the veterans and their neighbors had assumed that quiet civilian life was preferable to public recognition. Tom Murphy, whose hardware store had inadvertently become the epicenter of the controversy, had spent the 3 weeks developing relationships with local veterans that went far beyond commercial transactions. Murphy's own naval service, previously a minor footnote in his civilian identity, had become a bridge for connecting with other veterans who appreciated having someone who understood military culture running a business they frequented. Pastor Chen had incorporated Frank's experience into a series of sermons about judgment, forgiveness, and the hidden heroism that exists within every community. Chen's theological perspective on the events emphasized the spiritual dimensions of service, both military service to country and civilian service to community, and the ways that pride and assumptions could blind people to the sacred nature of both. As the ceremony concluded with the presentation of a community service award to Frank, an honor he accepted, Reluctantly but graciously, the crowd began to disperse with a different understanding of the veterans living among them. The memorial they had built would serve as a permanent reminder not just of military service in general, but of the specific lesson that heroism often chooses humility over recognition. Frank drove home that afternoon with mixed emotions about how his quiet civilian life had been permanently altered. The classified operations he had spent 30 years never discussing were still classified, but his general military service was now a matter of public record and community knowledge. The privacy he had treasured was gone, replaced by a level of recognition and respect that, while genuine, felt overwhelming to someone who had deliberately chosen anonymity. However, as he pulled into his driveway and saw the small American flag that someone had planted in his front yard, one of dozens that had appeared throughout the neighborhood in the weeks following his vindication, Frank realized that the events had created something valuable, despite their initial injustice. Millbrook had become a community that better understood and appreciated military service. Law enforcement had learned important lessons about investigation and respect, and perhaps most importantly, other veterans living quietly in similar communities might find themselves better understood and supported because of what had happened. The hardware store pin that had started everything remained exactly where it had always been, positioned with military precision on Frank's jacket. But now it carried not just personal meaning, but community significance. A symbol of service that had been tested, questioned, vindicated, and ultimately honored in ways that Frank had never sought, but had earned through decades of sacrifice that most people would never fully comprehend. In the end, Officer Mitchell's mistake had revealed a truth more important than the original accusation, that real heroes often walk among us unrecognized, that service to country takes many forms, and that a community's character is measured not by the mistakes it makes, but by how it responds when those mistakes are revealed. Millbrook had responded with humility, respect, and a commitment to do better, turning an incident of injustice into an opportunity for growth that would benefit veterans and civilians alike for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.